I gave my son everything: a car when he turned 18, college tuition without loans, a down payment for his first apartment. But when I called him at 3 in the morning, chest tight and struggling to breathe, he said he was too busy to drive me to the hospital. Too busy. I hung up that phone, looked at the keys to the car I bought him sitting on my kitchen counter, and realized something had to change. My name was still on the title, after all. If you've ever felt forgotten by the people you sacrificed everything for, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It was 3:17 in the morning when the pain hit. Not the dull ache I'd grown used to since Margaret passed, but something sharp and urgent that made me sit up straight in bed, gasping for air. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, counting off seconds that suddenly felt precious. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could just wait out until morning. Michael. I needed to call Michael. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The same phone where his picture still came up every time he called, though those calls had become rarer and rarer over the past 2 years. 2 years since we buried his mother. 2 years since everything changed. If you've ever felt forgotten by the people you sacrificed everything for, if you've ever wondered when love became conditional, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because this story is about learning the difference between giving and being taken advantage of. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. His voice was thick with sleep and irritation. "Dad, do you know what time it is?" "Michael, I need your help." The words came out breathless. "I'm having chest pains. Bad ones. I can't drive myself to the hospital." There was silence on the other end. Not the worried silence of someone processing an emergency, but the annoyed silence of someone being inconvenienced. "Dad, seriously, it's probably just anxiety again, like last time." Last time. He was referring to 6 months ago when I'd called him during a panic attack, when the grief over losing Margaret had overwhelmed me and I couldn't catch my breath. He'd driven me to the emergency room then, but he'd complained the entire way about missing work the next day. "This is different, son. Please, I just need someone to drive me. Dad, I have a presentation tomorrow morning, a big one. I can't be up all night at the hospital over nothing." Over nothing. His father's chest pain was nothing. "I'm not asking you to stay. Just drive me there, please. Can't you call an ambulance or something? That's what they're for." An ambulance. For his father. Rather than take 20 minutes out of his night. "Michael, I'm scared." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "I don't want to be alone with this." Another silence. Longer this time. "Look, Dad, I'm sure you're fine. You always think the worst. If it was really serious, you'd call 911, right? I've got to go. Big day tomorrow." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. The pain in my chest was still there, sharp and insistent, but now it was joined by something else, something that hurt in a different way. My son had just hung up on me, while I was having chest pains, while I was scared and alone in the middle of the night. I thought about Margaret, how she would have reacted if Michael had called her with the same problem. She would have been in the car before he finished explaining, probably still in her pajamas. That's what parents do. That's what love looks like. But a pair. Evidently, that's not how it worked in reverse. I called the Uber. $23 to get to the emergency room. The driver was a young man, maybe Michael's age, who kept asking if I was okay, if I needed him to drive faster. A stranger showed more concern for my well-being than my own son. "You sure you don't want me to wait?" he asked when we pulled up to the hospital entrance. "I can stick around, drive you home later." I thanked him, but said no. I didn't know how long I'd be, and I couldn't ask a stranger to sacrifice his night for me when my own son wouldn't. The emergency room was bright and cold. I sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs for 4 hours, watching other families come and go, mothers holding sick children, adult children pacing while their elderly parents were being examined, husbands and wives taking care of each other. I sat alone. The doctor was kind but efficient. My heart was fine. Blood pressure elevated, but not dangerously. Stress, he said, anxiety. Grief can manifest in physical symptoms, especially in older adults who've recently lost a spouse. "Is there someone who can drive you home?" he asked. "You shouldn't be behind the wheel when you're this worked up." I lied and said yes. Then I called another Uber. The ride home was quiet. The sun was starting to come up, painting the sky that soft pink Margaret always loved. I watched the familiar streets roll by and tried to process what had happened. My son thought I was being dramatic. My son thought I was manipulating him. My son hung up on me when I said I was scared. When did that happen? When did I become someone whose pain wasn't worth his time? I thought about the Michael who used to call me every Sunday evening just to check in. The Michael who would drive 3 hours to help me fix the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. The Michael who cried at his mother's funeral and held my hand during the service. That Michael wouldn't have hung up on me. That Michael would have been in his car before I finished asking for help. But that Michael had been disappearing for months now, maybe longer. Maybe I'd just been too afraid to see it. I got home as the sun was fully up. The house felt emptier than usual. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to read the morning paper, where Michael used to eat breakfast when he'd visit on weekends. Those weekends were rare now. The last time he'd been here was... when? I couldn't remember. Before Christmas, maybe. And even then, he'd seemed eager to leave, checking his phone constantly, making excuses about traffic. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a long time. Should I call him? Let him know I was okay? That it had just been anxiety, like he'd said? But what would be the point? He hadn't asked me to call. He hadn't seemed worried that he might be wrong. He hadn't even said he hoped I felt better. The medication the doctor gave me was sitting on the counter for anxiety and stress. Take as needed for overwhelming feelings of panic or grief. I realized I might need more than one prescription to get through this, because the pain in my chest had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with understanding that the person I'd raised to be caring and responsible had somehow learned that I wasn't worth caring for. Margaret would have been heartbroken. She would have called Michael immediately and had words with him. But Margaret wasn't here to protect me anymore. I was on my own, and apparently I had been for longer than I'd wanted to admit. The phone never rang that day. Michael never called to check if I was alive or dead. By evening, I understood that to him, it didn't really matter either way. The days after the hospital incident passed slowly. I kept expecting my phone to ring, kept expecting Michael to call and apologize, maybe explain that he'd been half asleep and hadn't understood how serious I was. But silence has its own weight, and by the end of the week, I realized no call was coming. That's when I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring for months, maybe longer. I was sitting in my recliner, the one Margaret always said was too big for the living room, when I noticed the calendar on the wall. 3 months since Michael had canceled Sunday dinner. Not postponed. Canceled. Something had come up with work, he'd said, but there'd been no offer to reschedule, no suggestion of when we might try again. Before that, he'd canceled twice in a row. Computer problems. His girlfriend wasn't feeling well. Always something. I got up and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept the family photos. Pictures of Michael graduating high school, college, his first apartment. In every photo, he was smiling. In most of them, Margaret and I were right beside him, proud and beaming. When had we stopped taking pictures together? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text messages. The pattern was right there, if I was honest enough to see it. Short responses from him. Long messages from me that he'd respond to with okay or sounds good. Messages from me asking how he was doing that he'd leave unread for days. The last time he'd initiated a conversation was... I scrolled back through weeks of texts. 2 months ago. And it had been to ask if he could borrow my car for the weekend. His was making a weird noise, he'd said. Could he pick up mine on Friday evening? I'd said yes, of course. I always said yes. That weekend had turned into a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. The weird noise in his car had never been diagnosed, never been fixed. My car had simply moved from my garage to his apartment complex, and I'd been too afraid to ask for it back. Afraid. That's what it came down to. I'd been afraid that if I said no to anything, if I asked for anything in return, he might stop calling altogether. Even the brief, unsatisfying calls we still had were better than nothing. Or so I'd told myself. I went to my desk and pulled out my checkbook. The bank statements were all there, organized the way Margaret had taught me. Deposits, withdrawals, everything accounted for. The pattern was there too, if I was willing to look. $600 for Michael's car repairs last spring. The repairs that apparently never happened, since he was still using my car. $800 when he needed help with his security deposit for the new apartment. The apartment where my car keys now lived on his key hook. $2,000 when he'd been between jobs for a month. Just temporary, he'd said. Just until he got back on his feet. $300 for his girlfriend's birthday gift. He'd wanted to get her something special, he'd said, but money was tight. Add it all up, and I'd given him nearly $4,000 in the past year. Not counting the car, the insurance I still paid on it, the maintenance and gas. When Margaret was alive, she used to warn me about this. "You're too generous," she'd say. "Michael needs to learn to stand on his own." But I disagreed. I was helping my son. I was being a good father, a provider. Isn't that what fathers were supposed to do? Margaret had been more direct toward the end, when the cancer had made her too tired for gentle suggestions. "He's using you, Robert," she'd said after Michael had left early from one of her chemo appointments to meet friends for dinner. "And you're letting him." I'd defended him then. He was young, I'd said, still figuring things out, still learning how to balance his own life with family responsibilities. But Margaret hadn't been talking about balance. She'd been talking about respect. I remembered the day she died. Michael had arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after I'd called him. 20 minutes, when he lived 15 minutes away. He'd been stopping for coffee, he'd explained. He hadn't realized how urgent it was. She was already gone by the time he walked into the room. He'd cried. I'll give him that. He'd stood beside her bed and cried like the little boy he used to be. But even then, even in that moment of grief, he'd kept checking his phone. At the funeral home, he'd argued about the costs. Do we really need the expensive flowers? She's not going to see them. At the service, he'd sat in the front row but spent half the time texting under his program. At the reception afterward, he'd left early. Work in the morning, he'd said. Margaret had been buried on a Saturday. I'd made excuses for all of it then. Grief affects people differently, I'd told myself. He's processing this in his own way. He's struggling with the loss. But sitting there with my checkbook open and my heart still sore from his callousness during my emergency, I finally saw what Margaret had seen. This wasn't grief or youth or a struggle to balance responsibilities. This was who Michael had become, someone who took without giving, someone who saw his father as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The worst part was remembering when it had started to change. Not all at once, but gradually, calls becoming shorter and less frequent. Visits becoming more about what he needed than how I was doing. Conversations where he'd interrupt me to take other calls, where he'd seem impatient for me to stop talking. I thought about the Michael who used to call me just to tell me about his day. The Michael who would ask my advice about work problems, relationship issues, life decisions. The Michael who used to say, "I love you, Dad," before hanging up. When had he stopped saying that? I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard those words from him. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment my heart jumped. Maybe. It was Michael, finally checking on me. It wasn't. It was a reminder from my doctor's office about an upcoming appointment. I realized I'd been hoping for something that wasn't coming. I'd been waiting for the son I'd raised to remember that he'd been raised to care about other people. But that son was gone, replaced by someone who could hang up on his frightened father and sleep soundly afterward. The next morning, I walked out to get the newspaper and noticed my car wasn't in the driveway. Of course it wasn't. It was across town at Michael's apartment, being used for errands I wasn't consulted about, burning gas I was paying for, racking up miles I wasn't tracking. I stood there in my empty driveway and felt something shift inside me, not anger, exactly. Something quieter but more solid. A decision being made without me consciously making it. Margaret would have been proud, I think. She'd always been stronger than me when it came to setting boundaries. "You teach people how to treat you," she used to say. "And right now you're teaching Michael that you don't mind being taken for granted." I'd thought I was teaching him about unconditional love, but maybe I'd been teaching him something else entirely. Maybe I'd been teaching him that love was conditional after all, conditional on what he could get from it. Standing there in my driveway, looking at the space where my car should have been, I finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's just enabling. And I'd been enabling my son to treat me like I didn't matter. But I mattered, even if he'd forgotten that. Even if I'd forgotten it myself for a while. I mattered, and it was time I started acting like it. I decided to visit Michael on Saturday morning. Nothing dramatic, Just a casual drop-in like I used to do when Margaret was alive and family felt more like family. I told myself I was going to check on him, maybe suggest we grab lunch together. But if I'm being honest, I think I knew I was going to see something I wouldn't like. I took an Uber to his apartment complex. Strange, paying for transportation to visit my own son, using my own car that was parked in his lot. But I'd gotten used to strange things lately. There it was, sitting in visitor parking like it belonged there. My blue Honda Civic, the one I'd bought 3 years ago after finally retiring Margaret's old sedan. She'd insisted I get something reliable, something that would last. "You need a car you can depend on," she'd said. I wondered what she'd think about it depending on someone else now. The car looked tired, dirty. There was a coffee stain on the rear bumper that hadn't been there when I'd last seen it. A parking ticket tucked under the windshield wiper, for parking in a handicapped space, apparently. Michael had never mentioned getting a ticket in my car. He'd certainly never offered to pay it. I climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, noticing how my knees protested more than they used to. Getting older has a way of sneaking up on you when you're not paying attention. I knocked on his door, and it took him a long time to answer. When he finally did, he was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, hair sticking up like he'd just woken up. It was almost 11 in the morning. "Dad?" He didn't look pleased to see me. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," I lied. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." He glanced back into his apartment, then reluctantly stepped aside to let me in. "You should have called first." The apartment was messier than I remembered. Dishes stacked in the sink, clothes draped over chairs, the coffee table covered with takeout containers and beer bottles. This was how he lived when no one was watching. But what caught my attention was the key hook by the front door. 5 sets of keys hanging there, and right in the middle, easy to grab on the way out, were mine. My car keys, with the little keychain Margaret had given me for Father's Day 3 years ago. A small wooden block with "World's Best Dad" burned into it. Michael followed my gaze and had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, I keep them there so I don't lose them," he said. "More convenient." Convenient, that was one way to put it. I sat down on his couch, moving aside a pizza box to make room. "How's the car running for you?" "Fine. Good. Thanks again for letting me borrow it." Borrow. As if there'd been a specific time frame discussed. As if there'd been any discussion at all beyond his assumption that what was mine was his. "Any word on when your car will be fixed?" He shrugged. "The shop is backed up. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, actually, because he'd never told me which shop, what was wrong with his car, or how much the repairs would cost. Details that would matter if this were actually a temporary arrangement. "Lisa and I are thinking of taking a weekend trip up to the coast," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Maybe next weekend." "That sounds nice. You two could probably use some time away." "Yeah, we've both been working so hard lately." I waited for him to ask if he could use the car for the trip. It seemed like the polite thing to do, even if he was going to take it anyway. But he didn't ask. He just assumed. "How far is the drive?" I found myself asking. "About 3 hours each way. Should be beautiful this time of year." 6 hours of driving in my car, plus whatever they'd do once they got there. Gas I'd pay for, wear and tear on my vehicle. For a romantic weekend I wasn't invited to share in even the planning of. "Michael," I said carefully, "about the other night, when I called you." His expression closed off immediately. "Dad, we don't need to do this." "I think we do. I was having chest pains. I was scared. I needed help. And you got help. You went to the hospital and you were fine. Just like I said." Just like he said, as if his dismissal had been vindicated rather than his callousness exposed. "I needed help from my son." "Dad, you're being dramatic. You always do this." Always do this. As if asking for help when I was frightened was a character flaw. As if needing my child when I was vulnerable was manipulative behavior. Do what exactly? Make everything into a big crisis. Make me feel guilty for having my own life. His own life. The life I'd helped him build with my money, my car, my constant availability whenever he needed something from me. I don't want you to feel guilty, Michael. I just want you to understand that when your father calls you at 3 in the morning, scared and in pain, hanging up on him isn't the response of someone who loves him. I didn't hang up on you. I had to go. I had work in the morning. You hung up while I was asking for help. You were fine, weren't you? The doctor said it was just anxiety. Just anxiety. Just terror in the middle of the night. Just a 72-year-old man sitting alone in his house, clutching his chest and wondering if he was dying. How would you have felt if it hadn't been anxiety? How would you have felt if something had really been wrong, and the last thing you'd said to me was that my health wasn't worth your time? He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. God, Dad, you really know how to lay on the guilt, don't you? Guilt. That's what he called it when I asked him to consider how his actions affected other people. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm trying to help you understand that relationships work both ways, that caring for each other is what families do. I do care about you. Do you? The question hung in the air between us. He turned from the window to look at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt exactly, but maybe recognition. Maybe a glimpse of the son I'd raised to be better than this. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and he immediately picked it up to read it. Lisa's wondering if we should leave for the coast on Friday night instead of Saturday morning, he said, scrolling through his messages. Might be less traffic. And just like that, I understood. I was sitting in his living room, trying to have a conversation about respect and love and basic human decency, and he was making weekend plans with my car. I stood up slowly. I should let you get back to your day. Yeah, I've got some things to do. He was still looking at his phone. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for stopping by. Like I was a neighbor who'd dropped off a casserole. Like I was anyone other than the man who'd raised him, supported him, loved him unconditionally for 28 years. I walked to the door, and my eyes went to the key hook again. My keys hanging there like they belonged to him now, like everything I'd worked for belonged to him now. Michael, I said, turning back to face him, I think I'll need the car back next week. He looked up from his phone, surprised. What for? What for? As if I needed a reason to use my own vehicle, as if I owed him an explanation for wanting access to something that was legally, financially, and morally mine. I have some errands to run. Can't you just take an Uber? I mean, you've been getting around fine without it. Getting around fine. Taking $20 Uber rides to the grocery store, to the doctor, to visit my own son. Spending my Social Security money on transportation while my car sat in his parking lot, accumulating tickets and coffee stains. It's my car, Michael. I know it's your car. I just meant, well, I really need it next weekend, for the trip. You need it. Yeah. I mean, we've already made plans. Plans made with my property, without my consultation, as if my needs and preferences didn't factor into decisions about my own belongings. I stood there looking at my son, really looking at him, and saw a stranger. Someone who could dismiss his father's pain and commandeer his possessions without a second thought. Someone who saw love as a one-way transaction and family as a resource to be exploited. I have to go, I said. Okay, I'll call you later. He wouldn't call me later. We both knew that. He'd call me when he needed something, just like always. I walked back down those stairs with my knees aching and my heart heavier than when I'd climbed them. But there was something else mixed in with the hurt now. Something harder and more decisive. I stood in the parking lot looking at my car one more time. The parking ticket was still there, fluttering in the breeze. A $60 fine for parking in a handicapped space. $60 that would come out of my pocket for Michael's convenience. The Uber driver who picked me up was chatty and kind. Visiting family? He asked. Something like that, I said. That's nice. Family's important. I agreed with him. But I realized I'd been wrong about what family meant. I'd thought it meant giving until it hurt, accepting whatever treatment came my way, being grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection were thrown in my direction. But family means caring for each other. It means respect flowing both ways. It means consideration and gratitude and love that shows up in actions, not just words. What I had with Michael wasn't family anymore. It was something else entirely. Something that had been eating away at my self-respect and sense of worth for longer than I'd been willing to admit. The drive home gave me time to think, time to plan, time to decide what I was going to do about the man my son had become and the father I'd allowed myself to become in response. By the time I walked into my empty house, I knew what needed to happen. It was time to stop enabling Michael's selfishness and start remembering what I was worth. It was time to take back more than just my car. Monday morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I walked out to my driveway expecting to see my car and remembered it wasn't there. But instead of feeling that familiar stab of resignation, I felt something different. Determination. I went inside and pulled out my insurance paperwork, the registration, the title. Everything was in order, everything in my name. The car was mine, legally and completely. I'd known that, of course, but seeing it in black and white felt important somehow. Then I did something else I hadn't done in a while. I paid attention to the details. I called my insurance company and asked about the recent claims history. No claims, thankfully, but there had been several small incidents reported. A parking ticket in downtown Portland, another ticket for speeding through a school zone, a warning for expired registration tags that I'd paid to renew, but apparently hadn't been placed on the car. All violations that Michael had never mentioned to me. I asked about the mileage tracking. When I'd last seen the car 2 months ago, it had 47,000 miles on it. According to the insurance company's last inspection, it now had over 52,000, 5,000 miles in 2 months, for someone who supposedly just needed it for local errands while his own car was being repaired. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment, processing what I'd learned. Then I did something that felt like a violation, but was legally my right. I called the dealership where I'd purchased the car and asked if they could run a report on recent service visits. The service manager was helpful and professional. Yes, the car had been in twice in the past month, once for an oil change and once for new tires. Both times the bill had been charged to the credit card on file, my credit card. Michael had been taking my car for maintenance and charging it to my account without telling me. He'd been making decisions about repairs and replacements like he owned the vehicle, and he'd been doing it all without so much as a phone call to let me know. I asked about the tire replacement. Why had they been changed? The old ones weren't due for replacement for at least another year when I'd last checked. Excessive wear, the service manager explained. Lots of highway driving looked like. The customer mentioned doing a lot of long-distance trips lately. Long-distance trips, while I'd been taking $20 Uber rides to the grocery store. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done since Margaret died. I walked over to my neighbor's house to chat. Helen had lived next door for 15 years. She'd brought casseroles after Margaret's funeral and always waved when she saw me working in the yard. She was retired too, and like most people our age, she paid attention to the neighborhood comings and goings. "Robert," she said when she answered the door. "How nice to see you. Come in, come in." Her living room was warm and comfortable, filled with family photos and the kind of furniture that lasted decades. She made tea while we talked about the weather and the new family moving in down the street. "How's Michael doing?" she asked, settling into her chair with her cup. "I see him around quite a bit." "You do?" "Oh, yes. He's here almost every day. Usually in the mornings. Sometimes afternoons, too. I see him getting into your car. Every day. Michael was at my house every day, and I hadn't known about it." "What's he doing here, do you know?" Helen looked at me curiously. "Well, I assumed he was checking on the house for you, or maybe picking up mail. He usually has packages with him when he leaves." Packages. Michael was having packages delivered to my house and picking them up without telling me. Does he ever have other people with him?" "Oh, yes, hi. His girlfriend comes sometimes. And last week there was a whole group of them. They were loading furniture into your car. I thought maybe you were giving some things away." Furniture. Michael had been using my house like a storage facility and my car like a moving truck, all without my knowledge. I thanked Helen and walked back to my house with a growing sense of violation. I went straight to the mailbox and found 3 package delivery notices tucked inside, addressed to Michael at my address. Packages I hadn't been told about, hadn't signed for, hadn't given permission for. I called the post office and asked about holding mail for someone who didn't live at my address. The clerk explained that it was possible if someone had filed a forwarding request, but they'd need to verify it with me as the homeowner. "Actually," she said, "we do have a note here that Michael Patterson has permission to collect mail and packages at your address. The authorization form was signed. Let me see. About 6 months ago." 6 months ago, right around the time Michael had started borrowing my car more frequently, right around the time our relationship had started feeling more transactional and less like family. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "I never signed any authorization form." There was a pause. "Sir, we have a form here with your signature authorizing Michael Patterson to receive mail at your address and collect packages on your behalf. Could you fax me a copy of that form?" 20 minutes later, I was staring at a document with what looked like my signature, but wasn't. Close enough to fool a busy postal clerk, but not close enough to fool the man who'd been signing his own name for 72 years. Michael had forged my signature to have packages delivered to my house. He'd been treating my home like his personal mailroom and my car like his personal delivery service. But the worst was yet to come. That evening I decided to check something I'd been avoiding. I logged into my credit card account online and looked at the recent charges. There were the car maintenance expenses I'd already learned about, but there were others too. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to. A charge at an electronics store for $800. Multiple charges at gas stations, presumably for my own car. And then I saw something that made my chest tighten in a different way than the night I'd called for help. A charge for $2,200 at a jewelry store. Dated last week, right around the time Michael had been telling me about his girlfriend's birthday. He'd bought his girlfriend jewelry with my credit card, while I was paying for Uber rides and eating canned soup to stretch my Social Security check. My son was making grand romantic gestures with my money. I sat at my kitchen table with the credit card statement spread in front of me and finally saw the complete picture. This wasn't just about borrowing a car or asking for occasional help. This was systematic. This was planned. This was my son treating me like an account to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The forged signature was the detail that hurt most. It meant this wasn't thoughtless or impulsive. It meant Michael had sat down and deliberately decided to deceive me. He'd practiced my signature and filed false paperwork and set up systems to take from me without my knowledge. I thought about calling him, demanding an explanation. But what explanation could there be? What possible justification for forging my signature, using my credit card, treating my house like his personal distribution center? I thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see this. She'd be heartbroken, I knew that, but she'd also be furious. Margaret had always been better at righteous anger than I was. She wouldn't have let it get this far. "You raised him better than this," I could hear her saying, "and you deserve better than this." I did raise him better. We both did. We taught him about honesty and respect and taking care of family. Somehow he'd learned those lessons but decided they only applied to what other people owed him, not what he owed others. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the progression of it all. How it had started with small requests and reasonable needs, how it had escalated gradually, each new violation a little worse than the last, how I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd failed to notice I'd already lost him. The son I'd raised would never have forged my signature. The son I'd raised would never have used my credit card without permission. The son I'd raised would have driven me to the hospital without question and stayed until he knew I was okay. That son was gone, had been gone for a while, apparently. What remained was someone who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a parent to be loved. By morning, I knew what I had to do, not out of anger, though there was plenty of that, not for revenge, though the betrayal cut deep, but for something more important than either of those things, for my own dignity, for the memory of the woman who taught me that love without respect wasn't really love at all, for the example I needed to set, even if Michael was no longer capable of learning from it. It was time to stop being taken advantage of. It was time to remember what I was worth and demand that others remember it too. It was time to take back control of my own life. I spent Tuesday morning sitting in my empty garage, staring at the oil stain where my car used to park. It was a perfect rectangle of darkness on the concrete, a shadow of what belonged there but wasn't. Kind of like my relationship with Michael, I realized. The shape of something that used to exist, but only the stain remained. Margaret's gardening tools were still hanging on the pegboard she'd installed 5 years ago, her all shovel, her pruning shears, the hand rake she'd used for the flower beds. I hadn't moved them since she died. Couldn't bring myself to pack them away, even though seeing them there reminded me every day of what I'd lost. But sitting there in the quiet of that empty garage, I understood something I'd been too afraid to see before. I'd been so focused on the tools Margaret had left behind that I'd forgotten about the lessons. And one of the most important lessons she'd tried to teach me was about the difference between love and enabling. "You can't love someone into being a good person, Robert," she'd said during one of our last real conversations. This was near the end, when the cancer had made her direct in a way she'd never been before. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them face the consequences of their choices. We'd been talking about Michael then, about his pattern of asking for help and disappearing until he needed something else. Margaret had seen it clearly, but I'd been making excuses. He was going through a hard time, I'd said. He was still learning how to be an adult. "He's 28, Robert. When do we stop calling it learning and start calling it choosing?" I'd been angry with her for saying that. How could she be so harsh about our son when she was dying, when every moment with family was precious? But now, sitting in the garage where my car should have been, where the evidence of Michael's systematic deception was as clear as that oil stain on the floor, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Michael wasn't struggling to be a good person. He wasn't learning how to balance his needs with other people's needs. He was choosing to be selfish, choosing to take without giving, choosing to see his father as a resource rather than a relationship, and I'd been choosing to let him. The realization came with a weight that settled in my chest, different from the anxiety that had sent me to the hospital. This was heavier but cleaner some. How? Like grief, but for something that had died slowly instead of all at once. I'd been grieving for Margaret for 2 years. Now I needed to grieve for the son I'd thought I had. I got up from my folding chair and walked over to Margaret's tool pegboard. She'd been so proud of organizing it, so satisfied with the neat arrangement of everything in its place. A place for everything, and everything in its place, she'd said, quoting her mother. That's how you keep from losing the important things. But what happened when the important things chose to leave? What happened when they took pieces of you with them and left only oil stains and empty hooks? I reached up and took down her hand rake. It was smaller than a regular rake, designed for working around delicate plants without disturbing their roots. She'd used it in her rose garden, carefully cultivating soil around each bush, giving them what they needed to grow strong and healthy. You have to prune the dead branches, she'd explained to me once when I'd questioned her aggressive trimming of a struggling rose bush. Otherwise, they'll drain energy from the healthy parts. Sometimes you have to cut away what's not working to save what is. Standing there with her rake in my hands, I finally understood the metaphor she'd been living by and trying to teach me. You can't save a relationship by feeding its dysfunction. You can't help someone grow by protecting them from the consequences of their poor choices. Sometimes loving someone means stepping back and letting them discover what they've lost. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is stop caring for them in ways that prevent them from learning to care for themselves. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be treated with disrespect, even when that refusal means being alone. I'd been afraid of losing Michael's love, but looking back honestly, I couldn't remember the last time he'd shown me love that wasn't conditional on what I could provide for him. When had he last called just to see how I was doing? When had he last offered to help with something I needed? When had he last treated me like someone whose feelings and needs mattered? The love I'd been afraid of losing had already been gone for months, maybe longer. What I'd been fighting to preserve was the illusion of love, the habit of love, the memory of love, but not love itself. Real love would have gotten in the car and driven me to the hospital. Real love wouldn't have hung up when I said I was scared. Real love wouldn't have forged my signature or used my credit card without permission or turned my home into a package depot without my knowledge. What Michael felt for me wasn't love, it was entitlement. And what I'd been calling love for him was actually fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being rejected, fear of having to face the truth about what our relationship had become. But Margaret had faced harder truths than this. She'd faced her own mortality with grace and courage, and she'd tried to teach me how to face difficult realities with the same strength. I'd been too afraid to learn the lesson while she was here to teach it, but it wasn't too late to learn it now. I hung the rake back on its hook and looked around the garage one more time. My car wasn't there, but that was okay. It was time to get it back, not because I was angry, though I was, not because I wanted to punish Michael, though he'd earned consequences for his choices. I was going to take back my car because it was mine, because I mattered, because my needs and preferences and dignity were worth protecting, even if my own son had forgotten that. I was going to take back my car because Margaret would have expected me to, because the woman who'd loved me for 38 years had seen something in me worth loving, and it was time I remembered what that was. I was going to take back my car, Becky. As the alternative was continuing to enable someone who'd learned that love meant never having to be accountable for how you treat people. And I was done teaching that lesson. I walked back into the house and sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. Time to make a plan. Time to figure out how to reclaim not just my vehicle, but my self-respect. Time to stop being a victim of my son's choices and start making some choices of my own. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in my ear as I started writing. "You're stronger than you think, Robert. You just forgot for a while." I hadn't forgotten. I'd been afraid. But fear wasn't a good enough reason to accept being treated poorly by anyone, including my own child. It was time to remember who I was before I became afraid. Time to remember that being a good father didn't mean accepting bad treatment from my son. Time to remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is your own child. Especially when that someone is your own child. Wednesday morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The decision had been made, and now it was just a matter of execution. I'd spent years in business before retiring, and I knew how to plan a project. This was just another kind of project, except the outcome would be my own dignity instead of a quarterly profit. I started with research. I called my insurance company first, confirming that as the title holder and policy owner, I had every legal right to reclaim my vehicle from anywhere it was parked. The agent I spoke with seemed puzzled by the question. "Sir, it's your car. You can take it anytime you want, from anywhere you want. You don't need anyone else's permission." Permission? That was exactly right. I'd been asking Michael's permission to use my own property. I'd been tiptoeing around his schedule and his needs and his convenience, all while he was systematically taking advantage of me. No more. I called 2 local towing services and explained the situation. Both assured me they could help, but I chose the smaller company because the owner took the time to understand what I was dealing with. "My son's been through something similar with his father-in-law," he said. "Family situations are always tricky. We'll handle this professionally and quietly." Quietly. That's exactly what I wanted. I wasn't trying to embarrass Michael or create a scene. I just wanted my car back, and I wanted to establish that there were going to be new rules in our relationship. Next, I called the post office and canceled Michael's authorization to receive mail at my address. The clerk asked if I wanted to forward his mail to his current address, and I gave them his apartment information. His packages could be delivered where he actually lived, like they should have been all along. Then I called my credit card company. This conversation was more difficult, because it meant admitting I'd been financially taken advantage of by my own son, but the representative was professional and helpful. "We'll need you to identify which charges were unauthorized," she explained. "Then we can issue you a new card with a different number and dispute the fraudulent charges." Fraudulent. That's what they were, even though the word felt harsh applied to my own child. But facts were facts, and the fact was that Michael had been using my credit card without permission. The jewelry store charge alone was more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. I spent an hour going through 6 months of statements, identifying charges I hadn't made. The total was over $3,000. $3,000 that Michael had spent on restaurants, electronics, gas for trips I hadn't known about, gifts for people I'd never met, while I'd been worrying about stretching my Social Security check to cover basic expense. Says my son had been living well on my credit. The hardest call was to the DMV. I needed to confirm my ownership status and make sure there were no liens or complications that would prevent me from reclaiming the car. The clerk was efficient and matter-of-fact. "The title is clear and in your name only, sir. No liens, no complications. You have full legal ownership." What if someone else has been using the vehicle regularly? Does that create any kind of claim? Not unless they're on the title or the insurance policy, and I don't see any other names listed here. It's your car, sir. Period. Your car. Period. Simple as that. By Thursday afternoon, I had all my paperwork organized and my plan finalized. I would have the car towed on Tuesday morning when I knew Michael would be at work. I'd leave a note explaining the situation and providing my new phone number for any respectful communication he might want to have about our relationship going forward. Because yes, I was changing my phone number too. I'd realized that Michael only called when he needed something, and those calls had become sources of stress rather than joy. I wanted a phone that rang because people actually wanted to talk to me, not because they wanted something from me. I spent the weekend cleaning house, both literally and figuratively. I went through Michael's old room and packed up everything that belonged to him, not angrily, not vindictively, just practically. He was 28 years old with his own apartment. His childhood belongings didn't need to be taking up space in my house anymore. I found things I'd forgotten about. The trophy from his high school debate team, when he'd been passionate about justice and fairness. The thank you card he'd written me after I'd helped him move into his first apartment, telling me I was the best dad ever, and promising he'd never forget everything I'd do. One for him. The card was dated 3 years ago. 3 years since he'd expressed genuine gratitude or affection that wasn't immediately followed by a request for help. I packed it all carefully in boxes and stacked them neatly in the garage. When Michael was ready to have an adult conversation about respect and boundaries, he could pick them up. If he was never ready for that conversation, well, that would tell me everything I needed to know. Sunday evening, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret died. I cooked myself a real dinner. Not canned soup or a frozen meal, but actual cooking. Pork chops and mashed potatoes and green beans, the kind of meal Margaret used to make when we wanted to celebrate something. I was celebrating, I realized. Not the end of my relationship with Michael. I still hoped we could rebuild something better. But the end of accepting treatment that diminished me. The end of being afraid to stand up for myself. The end of confusing, enabling with loving. I ate dinner at the kitchen table with Margaret's chair across from me, empty but not forgotten. I talked to her like I used to do when she was here, telling her about my plans and my fears and my hopes for what would come next. "I think you'd be proud of me," I said to the empty chair. "I'm finally learning what you tried to teach me about boundaries." The house felt different that night. Not less lonely. I was still alone, after all, but less heavy somehow, like a weight I'd been carrying for months had been lifted from my shoulders. Monday night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Tomorrow would be the first day in months that my car would be in my own driveway. Tomorrow would be the first day of whatever came next. I woke up Tuesday morning at dawn and made coffee with hands that were steady for the first time in weeks. I showered and dressed carefully like I was going to an important business meeting. In a way, I suppose I was. I was meeting the man I used to be before I got lost in trying to maintain a relationship that had stopped it, amid being reciprocal. At 8:30, I called the towing company. "We're ready when you are, Mr. Patterson." "I'm ready," I said, and I was. The tow truck arrived at Michael's apartment complex at 9:15 on Tuesday morning. I rode along, partly because I wanted to make sure everything went smoothly, and partly because I needed to see this through myself. The driver was professional and discreet, just as promised. My car was parked in the same visitor spot where I'd seen it on Saturday, still displaying the parking ticket I'd noticed before. The driver had it hooked up and ready to go in less than 10 minutes. Efficient and quiet, like a medical procedure. I left the note I'd written on Michael's door. Nothing angry or accusatory, just factual. "Michael, I've reclaimed my car as it belongs to me and I need it back. I've canceled your mail authorization and changed my credit card number due to unauthorized charges. If you'd like to discuss our relationship respectfully, my new number is below. I love you, but I won't continue to accept being taken advantage of. Dad." Simple and direct, the way Margaret would have done it. The drive home in my own car felt strange. The seat was adjusted differently, the mirrors weren't right, and there were fast food wrappers in the cup holders. The gas tank was nearly empty despite my having paid for a fill-up just last week, according to my credit card statement. But it was my car, in my possession, responding to my hands on the steering wheel. For the first time in months, I could go where I wanted to go when I wanted to go there. The freedom was almost overwhelming. I spent the afternoon running errands I'd been putting off for weeks. The bank, the grocery store, the post office. Simple things that had become complicated when I'd had to coordinate with Michael's schedule or pay for transportation. Normal things that felt rems. Our cable after months of dependency. The first call came at 4:30 that afternoon. My old phone, the number Michael still had, rang with an intensity that suggested multiple missed calls. I let it ring. I'd told him in the note that my new number was the way to reach me now. If he wanted to communicate, he could follow the simple instruction I'd given him. The second call came at 5:15, then another at 6, then several more throughout the evening, each one going to voicemail on a phone I'd already decided to disconnect. The next morning I drove to my cellular provider and canceled the old service. The young woman helping me asked if I wanted to retrieve my voicemails first. "How many are there?" I asked. 17, sir, all from yesterday evening." 17 calls. Michael had called 17 times in the span of 4 hours, but he hadn't called the new number I'd provided. That told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. He was angry, not apologetic. He was demanding, not reflecting. "No, thank you," I told the clerk. "I don't need to hear them." Wednesday afternoon, Michael showed up at my house. I saw him through the window, pacing on my front porch, agitated and clearly furious. He knocked hard enough that the sound echoed through the house like gunshots. I took my time answering, breathing deeply and reminding myself that I was in my own home, dealing with someone who had systematically deceived and taken advantage of me. I had nothing to apologize for, and nothing to feel guilty about. When I opened the door, the young man standing there barely resembled the son I'd raised. His face was red with anger, his hands clenched into fists, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted before I could even say hello. "You had my car towed? Are you completely out of your mind?" My car, not his car, but in his mind, apparently, ownership had already transferred simply because he'd been using it for months. "Hello, Michael," I said calmly. "Please lower your voice. The neighbors don't need to hear this conversation." "I don't give a damn about the neighbors. I want my car back right now." "It's not your car. It never was your car. It's my car, registered in my name, insured by me, and now it's back where it belongs." "Don't give me that legal bullshit. You know I've been using it. You know I need it. Need, not want, need. As if his wants had somehow become my obligations without any reciprocal obligations on his part. "You've been using it without my permission while I've been paying for transportation. You've been having packages delivered to my house without my authorization. You've been using my credit card without my knowledge. This isn't about the car, Michael. This is about respect." "Respect?" He laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "You want to talk about respect? You're the one acting like a petty old man, taking away my transportation because I couldn't drop everything to drive you to the hospital for another panic attack. Petty old man, another panic attack. His dismissal of my genuine health scare was complete and cruel. I called you because I was frightened and in pain. You hung up on me. That's not something a loving son does to his father. You're being dramatic, just like always. Everything's always a crisis with you since Mom died." Since Mom died. As if my grief was an inconvenience to him rather than a natural response to losing the woman I'd loved for 38 years. "Your mother would be heartbroken to see how you're treating me. Don't you dare bring her into this. Mom always said you were too soft, too willing to be a victim. Maybe if you'd grown a backbone years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Too soft. Too willing to be a victim. A court. Ding to Michael, Margaret had criticized me for the same generous nature that had allowed him to take advantage of me for months. I doubted that very much. Margaret had worried about my boundaries, yes, but she'd never called me soft or criticized my caring nature. She'd loved that about me, even when she'd wished I was better at protecting myself. "I'm not being a victim anymore, Michael. I'm setting boundaries. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to be based on mutual respect." "Mutual respect?" His voice got even louder. "You're holding my car hostage and you want to talk about respect? It's not your car. I've been using it every day for months. I've put thousands of miles on it. I've been taking care of it." Taking care of it. By running up parking tickets and putting excessive wear on the tires and using my credit card to pay for maintenance without telling me. "You've been using it every day without permission while charging expenses to my credit card without authorization. That's not taking care of it, Michael. That's stealing." The word hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Stealing. It was harsh, but it was accurate, and we both knew it. "I can't believe you just called me a thief." "I called your behavior theft because that's what it was. Forging my signature to have mail delivered here, using my credit card without permission, taking my car and treating it like your property. What would you call it?" "I would call it a son expecting his father to act like a father instead of like a stranger." A father. In Michael's mind, being a father meant providing unlimited resources without expecting respect or consideration in return. It meant being available for his needs while having none of my own that mattered. Being a father doesn't mean letting you walk all over me, Michael. Your mother and I raised you better than this. You raised me to depend on family, and now you're pulling the rug out from under me because I couldn't drop everything to hold your hand throbbed. Another anxiety attack. Another anxiety attack. He kept coming back to that, as if my moment of genuine need was the real problem, rather than his response to it. "I'm not pulling any rug, son. I'm just not laying it down anymore for you to walk on." "Fine." He turned away from the door, then turned back. "You want to be alone? You got it. Don't call me when you need something, because I'm done. I'm done with this family, and I'm done with you." "Michael, no. You made your choice. You chose being right over being family. I hope it was worth it." He stormed off my porch and down the driveway, and I watched him go with a heavy heart but clear conscience. This wasn't the conversation I'd hoped for, but it was the conversation that was necessary. He'd shown me exactly who he was when he didn't get his way. He'd chosen anger over apology, demands over discussion, ultimatums over understanding, and he'd revealed what he really thought of me: a resource to be managed, a convenience to be utilized, someone whose feelings and needs didn't matter as long as his were being met. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of what had just happened. My son had walked away from me, from our relationship, from any chance of rebuilding something healthy between us. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But it also clarified something I'd been afraid to see. Michael wasn't interested in a relationship based on mutual respect and caring. He wanted what he'd had before: unlimited access to my resources without any accountability for how he treated me. And that wasn't a relationship I was willing to have anymore, even with my own son, especially with my own son. The next few days brought calls from other family members who'd heard Michael's version of events. His aunt, Margaret's sister, called to tell me I was being unreasonable. A cousin called to suggest I was overreacting to it. Normal family dynamics. I listened politely and explained my side without trying to make Michael look bad. I told them about the forged signature, the unauthorized credit card use, the systematic deception. Some understood, others didn't. "He's your son," Margaret's sister said. "Family forgives family." "Family also respects family," I replied. "And respect has to go both ways." Not everyone agreed with my decision, and that was okay. I wasn't looking for validation from people who hadn't lived through what I'd experienced. I was looking for peace with the choices I'd made. And surprisingly, I was finding it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the community center, about to walk into my first meeting as a volunteer with the local food bank. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, and the sun was warm through the windshield of the car that now lived where it belonged, in my own driveway. The car ran beautifully. I'd had it thoroughly serviced after getting it back, replacing the prematurely worn tires and addressing some maintenance issues that had been neglected. The mechanic had commented on the excessive mileage for the age of the vehicle, but everything was in good working order now. More importantly, I knew where every mile on it came from. Every trip to the grocery store, every drive to the doctor, every journey to new places I'd started exploring since reclaiming my independence. The phone on the passenger seat, the new phone with the new number, had been quiet all morning. That was normal now. It rang when Helen from next door wanted to chat about neighborhood happenings. It rang when my cousin from Arizona called for our monthly catch-up. It rang when Dr. Morrison's office confirmed appointments. It rang when people wanted to talk to me, not when they wanted something from me. Michael's number wasn't in this phone. He'd never called the new number I'd give. And him in the note. In 6 months there had been no contact at all, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, no acknowledgement that perhaps he'd handled things poorly. The silence told its own story. I got out of the car and walked toward the community center, thinking about how different I felt than I had 6 months ago. The constant background anxiety was gone, the feeling of walking on eggshells, of never knowing when the next demand would come, of always wondering if I was doing enough. All of that had lifted. I wasn't happier, exactly. There was still grief for the relationship I'd hoped to have with my son, still sadness about the way things had ended, but I was calmer, steadier, more like the man I'd been before I'd gotten lost in trying to maintain something that hadn't been worth maintaining. The volunteer coordinator was a woman named Sarah, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and capable hands. She'd explained the work when I'd first called, sorting donations, packing food boxes for families in need, helping with the weekend distribution. "We get people from all walks of life," she'd said during our interview. "Young families going through hard times, elderly folks on fixed incomes, people between jobs. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a story." I'd been thinking about that a lot lately. About my story. About Margaret's story. About the story I'd thought Michael and I were writing together versus the story we'd actually been living. The work at the food bank was physically demanding but emotionally satisfying. There was something healing about spending time with people who understood what it meant to need help, who were grateful for assistance, who treated volunteers with respect and appreciation. I'd met other volunteers who'd become real friends. Tom, a retired teacher who'd lost his wife the same year I'd lost Margaret. Betty, a grandmother who'd raised her kids alone and now had time to give back to her community. Frank, a veteran who'd found purpose in service after struggling with his own demons. None of them wanted anything from me except my presence and participation. None of them saw me as a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. They just enjoyed my company, and I enjoyed theirs. It was what friendship was supposed to feel like, I'd realized. What family was supposed to feel like. After the morning shift, Tom and I went for coffee like we'd started doing every Tuesday. He was good company, intelligent, funny, direct in the way that people our age could afford to be. "How are you doing, Robert?" he asked after we'd ordered. "Really doing, I mean, not the polite answer." Tom was one of the few people who knew the whole story about Michael. He'd listened without judgment when I'd needed to talk through what had happened, and he'd offered perspective without trying to tell me what I should do. "I'm doing well," I said, and realized I meant it. "Better than I have in a long time, actually." "Still no word from Michael?" "No, and I've stopped expecting there will be." That was true. Somewhere over the past few months, I'd stopped listening for my phone to ring with his voice. I'd stopped checking my old email account to see if he'd tried to reach me there. I'd stopped hoping he'd show up at my door with an apology and an explanation. I'd accepted that the son I'd raised, the one who'd been capable of love and respect and consideration, was gone. Maybe he'd grown out of those qualities, or maybe I'd enabled him to forget them. Either way, the young man who'd taken his place wasn't someone I could have a healthy relationship with. "Do you miss him?" Tom asked. "I miss who I thought he was," I said. "I miss who he used to be, or who I remember him being. But the person he became? The one who could hang up on me when I was scared, who could forge my signature and use my credit card and treat me like an ATM. No, I don't miss that person." "That's healthy," Tom said. "A lot of people can't make that distinction. It took me a while to learn it. Margaret tried to teach me, but I wasn't ready to listen. We learn when we're ready to learn, not before." Tom had lost his wife to a heart attack. Sudden, no warning, no time to prepare. My loss had been different, watching Margaret fade over months of treatment and hope and gradual acceptance. But grief was grief, and we'd found comfort in sharing the experience with someone who understood. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said, "for standing up for yourself, for not letting Michael continue to take advantage." "I hope so. Some days I wonder if I was too harsh, if I should have tried harder to work things out." "Robert, you tried for months to work things out. You gave him every opportunity to treat you with basic respect. He chose not to take those opportunities." That was the key word. Chose. Michael had made choices, consistently and deliberately, about how to treat me. And I'd finally made choices about how much of that treatment I was willing to accept. After coffee, I drove home through neighborhoods I'd started exploring since getting my car back. It was amazing how much of my own city I'd never seen when I'd been dependent on others for transportation. There were parks I hadn't known existed, small businesses I'd never noticed, whole areas that had been just names on a map. Independence had geography, I'd discovered. It had routes and destinations and the freedom to change your mind about where you were going. At home, I spent the afternoon working in Margaret's garden. I'd let it go after she died. Couldn't bring myself to tend the roses she'd loved so much. But recently, I'd started caring for them again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The roses were responding well to attention. New growth, healthy leaves, buds that would bloom soon. Margaret would. I'd have been pleased to see them flourishing again. I was watering the bushes when Helen came over from next door, carrying a plate covered with foil. "Chocolate chip cookies," she announced. "Made too many again." Helen had been making too many cookies and bringing them over since Margaret died. I suspected she wasn't really making too many, just being kind to a neighbor who'd lost his wife. But I appreciated the gesture and enjoyed her company. "How was the volunteer work today?" she asked. I told her about the families we'd helped, the donation of fresh vegetables from a local farm, the new volunteer who'd started training. Normal conversation about normal life. "You seem happier lately," she observed. "More like yourself." More like myself. That was exactly right. I'd been lost for a while, trying to be someone I wasn't, someone who could accept being treated poorly by his own son, someone who could pretend that wasn't painful. "I feel more like myself," I said. It took me a while to remember who that was. After Helen went home, I sat on my front porch with one of her cookies and watched the evening settle over the neighborhood. Kids riding bikes, couples walking dogs, the ordinary rhythm of life in a place where people cared about each other. My phone rang, the new phone, with a call from my cousin in Arizona. We talked for an hour about her grandchildren. my volunteer work, the weather, the small details that make up a life. It was the kind of conversation Margaret and I used to have with family, easy and warm and reciprocal. When I hung up, I realized something had changed in how I thought about the future. For months after Margaret died, and especially during the worst period with Michael, I'd felt like I was just marking time, just getting through each day without any real sense of purpose or direction. Now I had plans, small ones but real ones. The volunteer coordinator had asked if I'd be interested in helping with their summer youth program. Tom had invited me to join his hiking group. There was a community college course on local history I was considering auditing. Nothing dramatic or life-changing, just the ordinary plans of someone who expected to be around to see them through and looked forward to the experience. I thought about Michael, as I did most evenings, but without the ache I'd felt for so long. I hoped he was well. I hoped he'd learned something from our confrontation, though I didn't expect to ever know if he had. Mostly I hoped he'd find his way back to the values Margaret and I had tried to teach him. Not for my sake. I'd made my peace with our estrangement, but for his sake, and for the sake of whatever relationships he'd have in the future. People who only know how to take eventually find themselves with nothing left to take. People who don't learn to treat others with respect eventually find themselves alone with their selfishness. I didn't want that for my son, even though I couldn't prevent it anymore. The sun was setting, painting Margaret's roses in golden light. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in my own house, make coffee in my own kitchen, and drive my own car to wherever I decided I wanted to go. I'd lost a son, but I'd found myself again. That wasn't the trade I would have chosen, but it was the one I'd been given, and I'd learned to live with it. Some stories don't have the endings we hoped for, but they can still have endings we can live with, endings that honor the people we used to be and the people we're still capable of becoming. Margaret had taught me that love without respect isn't really love. I'd finally learned the lesson, even though it cost me more than I'd ever expected to pay. But some lessons are worth the price, even when paying it breaks your heart. I finished my cookie and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to be useful, to be kind, to be the kind of person Margaret had seen in me from the beginning. The kind of person who deserved to be treated well, especially by the people who claimed to love him. I'd forgotten that for a while, but I remembered it now, and remembering it had set me free.